The sun fell gently over the village of Lillingham Green, like a warm shawl cast upon the shoulders of a dozing matron. It was the kind of June day one might find on a postcard, golden, green, and utterly deceiving. In the garden behind the vicarage, bunting fluttered cheerily among the rose arbours and hydrangea bushes, the tables groaning under the weight of sponge cakes, finger sandwiches, and chilled elderflower cordial. A quartet of local musicians plucked and tooted an aimless tune that rose and fell like polite laughter among the guests. Miss Jane Marple, spinster of St. Mary Mead, had been invited by Mrs. Lavinia Colthorpe, the vicar's wife, more out of respect than affection. Lavinia was a woman of sharp hats and sharper judgments, but even she could not deny that Miss Marple's lace-knitting presence added a certain quaintness to any respectable function. Such a delight to see the young. "People out," Mrs. Colthorpe was declaring, her voice as brittle as a meringue shell. "Though I must say, it's the old who are truly dependable. Don't you think so, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple, seated beneath a striped parasol with a glass of lemonade in one hand and her knitting in the other, smiled benignly. "Young people often do try very hard to be surprising," she said mildly, "whereas older folk are more content to let their surprises unfold quietly, like a well-made jam." That earned a tight laugh from Lavinia, and then her attention was drawn elsewhere, to her cousin-in-law, Denny Colthorpe, newly returned from years abroad and looking distinctly out of place in the staid greenery of the English countryside. Denny was tanned, charming, and slightly tipsy, holding court near the punch bowl. Beside him, several ladies fluttered like moths around a candle, one of them being Miss Elspeth Vernon, the solicitor's daughter, far too interested in Denny's tales of Ceylon and Cairo. From across the lawn, a shriek pierced the summer calm. It came from Miss Penny Hargreaves, a local schoolmistress known for her dramatics and peculiar affection for Greek tragedies. But this was no stage cry. She stood near the rose trellis, a hand at her throat, pointing toward the shrubs with wide, startled eyes. Guests surged to their feet, their polite facades collapsing in a clatter of teacups. "Good heavens," Lavinia gasped, bustling forward. "What is it, Penny?" Penny staggered back, pale as chalk. I was trying to fetch the vicar's dog. He darted off into the hedge, and then I saw someone lying there. A man. He's not moving." Within minutes, the garden party dissolved into chaos. The musicians stopped playing. Chairs were knocked over. Mr. Abrams, the local constable, arrived looking flustered and slightly annoyed to have been called away from his afternoon nap. Miss Marple rose slowly, carefully setting down her lemonade. "Best not to crowd," she murmured, almost to herself. Though one does wonder how a perfectly healthy man ends up quite lifeless in a bed of peonies. As she approached the scene, cautiously, discreetly, she saw the body sprawled in the shaded nook behind the trellis. It was Denny Colthorpe. His cravat had been loosened as if he had struggled for breath. His wristwatch, gold and expensive, had cracked in the fall. Miss Marple noticed, without needing to kneel, that the hands had stopped precisely at 3:17. "Poor boy," Lavinia whispered, her gloved hand covering her mouth. "He said he had a touch of sunstroke earlier." Miss Marple didn't respond. She was looking, not at Denny's face, but at the sprig of crushed rosemary beneath his shoulder, and at the expressions playing across the faces around her. Elspeth Vernon was trembling. Mr. Hawkins, the vicar's groundsman, stood stiff as a post, and Mrs. Charity Hockley, who ran the Lillingham Ladies' Literary Circle, had gone curiously silent. It must have been natural causes, someone said, hopefully. But Miss Marple, watching the crowd with the same mild interest she might give to the changing of flower beds in the spring, only murmured, "People rarely fall into rose bushes when they are feeling perfectly well." She noted something else too. The watch on Denny's wrist had stopped during a lie. He had been speaking to Elspeth Vernon at 3:17, claiming something about a tiger hunt. Miss Marple remembered clearly, because she'd heard him say it as she counted the rows of her knitting. But she also knew enough of tigers, timepieces and truth to realize that nothing about Denny Colthorpe's death was likely to be quite so simple. Miss Marple moved quietly along the edge of the rose trellis, her steps soundless on the well-tended grass. The crowd had backed away now, forming a loosely knit semicircle of concerned villagers and curious onlookers. Mr. Abrams, red in the face and breathing through his mouth, was kneeling beside Denny Colthorpe's body, his hands hovering uncertainly. He had the look of a man attempting to remember everything he had ever been told about police procedure, most of which came from pamphlets issued by the county. "Well," he said at last, pushing his cap up his forehead, "he's dead. Best not to touch anything until Dr. Lovelace arrives." "Someone should fetch the vicar," Lavinia Colthorpe said faintly. "He was called away to the rectory only half an hour ago to speak with the bishop by telephone. He wouldn't want this tragedy, on his lawn," murmured Charity, Hockley, her thin lips quivering. She turned to Miss Marple. "Jane, you've seen many such things, haven't you? In London, during the war?" "Oh, no," said Miss Marple gently, "but one does pick up a great deal simply by observing. There's a remarkable amount of human nature to be found in a post office queue, you know." She said nothing more, but her eyes returned once again to the broken watch, its glint catching the sun between the leaves. 3:17. It had struck her not just for its precision, but because of something peculiar about the hands. They were frozen at the very moment Denny had been spinning one of his elaborate stories. Miss Marple could still hear his voice in her memory. "Thick with charm. It was a tiger, you see, in Bengal. They told me not to go off alone, but I've never been one to follow dull advice." She had glanced up from her knitting at the time, amused more than anything else. Not by the tale, which was clearly embroidered, but by Elspeth Vernon's reaction. The young woman had smiled too tightly, had folded her arms too quickly, small tells that Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime quietly watching people lie to themselves and others, never failed to notice. Now, Elspeth was standing quite still, a handkerchief clutched in one hand, her other arm being gently held by her father, Lionel Vernon. The village solicitor looked pale and strained. He leaned in close to his daughter. "Did you say something to him?" he murmured. "Before he left you?" Elspeth shook her head quickly, eyes fixed on the ground. "No, just small talk. He was being silly again, talking about tiger hunts and hidden rubies. I thought he was joking." Miss Marple caught the flicker in her voice, an edge of something unspoken. She noted it but said nothing aloud. That was the way with young women. What they said was often far less important than what they left unsaid. Dr. Lovelace arrived 20 minutes later in his Morris Minor, huffing and apologizing as he made his way to the body. The guests had begun to drift toward the refreshments table again, not out of indifference but out of helplessness. What does one do with death in the middle of a fete? The scones still needed buttering, and Mrs. Wendell's trifle was beginning to melt. "Missy." Marple watched as Dr. Lovelace gently examined the body, brushing aside the lapel of Denny's linen coat. After a moment, the doctor straightened and cleared his throat. "Heart failure most likely," he said. "There's no visible wound, no sign of struggle. Heat can do strange things, even to healthy men." "But he was perfectly fine just moments before," Elspeth said suddenly, her voice brittle. "He'd had a drink, but he wasn't ill." Miss Marple, still seated, turned her eyes toward the punch bowl. "Was it the elderflower or the lemonade he drank?" she asked lightly. Though her gaze was sharp, Constable Abrams blinked. I believe it was the punch. Someone said he poured a glass just before he spoke with Miss Vernon." Miss Marple nodded and rose, brushing a fleck of grass from her skirt. She wandered toward the table where the punch bowl still sat, half full, the ladle resting askew. A wasp hovered near the rim. "May I, Constable?" she asked sweetly. I suppose," Abrams said, though his uncertainty showed. "As long as you don't, contaminate anything." She dipped the ladle gently, letting a small amount of the punch trickle into an empty teacup. Then she sniffed. Not just elderflower and fruit, but something beneath it, something bitter. "Funny," she said, mostly to herself. "Bitter almonds, perhaps." Abrams blinked. "What's that mean?" Dr. Lovelace cleared his throat. "It could suggest cyanide. But that's a dreadful leap to make on a sunny afternoon. We won't know anything until the postmortem." "I dare say not," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But one does wonder who brought the punch." The answer came from Lavinia Colthorpe, who looked shocked to be consulted. "Well, I prepared it, of course. But the servants carried it out, Elsie and John. You know them, Jane. They've both been with us for years." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, very trustworthy. And I'm sure no one else handled it between the kitchen and the garden." Lavinia faltered. "Well, Denny did refill his glass at one point, I believe. He said it needed fortifying and wandered off. Oh dear." Miss Marple said nothing more but turned her eyes back to the crowd. People were dispersing now, murmuring in small clumps like birds unsettled from a branch. But the air in Lillingham Green had changed. A hush had fallen over the village, not the silence of peace, but that peculiar tension that follows when something very old, a certainty, a trust, is quietly broken. Later that afternoon, as the body was taken away and the guests departed in subdued clusters, Miss Marple walked slowly toward the edge of the garden, her parasol resting on her shoulder. She stopped beneath the rose trellis, where the crushed rosemary still gave off its faint, pungent scent. Kneeling briefly, she plucked a small silver pin from the grass, a plain thing unnoticed by others, but still slightly bent. She held it in her palm, examining it carefully. Not from Denny's jacket, she thought. Too fine. Perhaps from a woman's blouse. Or a hat. As she stood, she caught sight of Elspeth again, speaking softly to Mr. Vernon near the gate. Her shoulders were tight, defensive. Miss Marple sighed. She had seen it many times before. Lies often walked in pairs, one to distract and one to protect, and somewhere between a glass of punch, a stopped watch, and a story about tigers that had never been true, a much older story was beginning to surface. One rooted not in foreign lands or rare poisons, but in the quiet passions and small betrayals of English village life, the kind that bloomed, hidden, just like weeds in a rose garden. The evening settled softly over Lillingham Green, casting long shadows across the neat hedgerows and thatched roofs. The village had grown quiet, too quiet, thought Miss Marple, as the last guests had drifted away from the vicarage garden, leaving behind the faint scent of crushed roses and something less tangible, a tension that clung to the air like stubborn mist. Miss Marple remained behind, seated in the vicarage drawing-room, knitting quietly as the household prepared for the arrival of the coroner and the inevitable formal inquiries. The room was still bright with late afternoon light, but there was a heaviness to the silence, as if the house itself mourned a guest now cruelly absent. Lavinia Colthorpe hovered nearby, nervously adjusting her gloves and murmuring half-formed questions, but Miss Marple was not inclined to speak just yet. She was listening to the undercurrent of voices, the fragments of conversations that had brushed past her like soft breezes in the garden. What struck her most was the way the villagers reacted, how they spoke, what they avoided saying. People revealed themselves more in their silences and evasions than in what they chose to say aloud. Later, as twilight deepened, the coroner's man arrived, accompanied by a grim-faced constable from the county. Miss Marple watched as they examined the body, now laid out in the vicarage's modest parlour. The gold watch remained in place on Denny Colthorpe's wrist, the glass cracked but the hand still frozen at 3:17. Dr. Lovelace had already returned from the initial examination and now stood in quiet conversation with the coroner's assistant. "There are no external wounds, no sign of poison," Lovelace said quietly, though his expression betrayed a certain unease. "It's likely heart failure, but we must wait for the autopsy to confirm." "Yet that broken watch," murmured the assistant, adjusting his spectacles. "It stopped at the very moment of death. Curious." Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. The watch was a detail others found curious, but for her it was a clue wrapped in a riddle. As the officials departed, Miss Marple rose and made her way outside, drawn toward the narrow lane where the village's whispered gossip was already beginning to stir. The lamplighter made his rounds, casting flickering pools of yellow light, and through the veil of dusk she saw familiar faces gathered in small groups, each cluster a constellation of suspicion and fear. Miss Marple approached a knot of villagers near the village green. There was Mrs. Charity Hockley, her usual chatter replaced by a rigid composure. Mr. Hawkins, the groundsman, his hands deep in his pockets and eyes darting nervously. And across from them, Miss Penny Hargreaves, her expression flushed and eyes bright with unshed tears. "Good evening," Miss Marple greeted them softly. Mrs. Hockley glanced sharply, but said nothing. Mr. Hawkins nodded stiffly, and Penny stepped forward. "Jane," she said in a low voice, "it's awful, simply awful. I don't know how anyone can carry on as if nothing's happened." Miss Marple nodded, folding her hands calmly. "Grief takes many forms, Penny, and people often speak when they feel least able to." Penny hesitated, glancing furtively around, before lowering her voice further. "There are things people aren't telling. I heard from Elsie, the housemaid, that Denny had a quarrel with someone just before the party started." "Quarrel?" Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-motion. "Yes." She said it was in the stables. "Something about money. Denny owed someone quite a sum, but no one is saying who." Miss Marple considered this quietly. Money was often the unspoken motive in such tragedies, though in a village like Lillingham Green, such matters were carefully veiled beneath layers of civility. "Did Elsie mention who the other party was?" Miss Marple asked. Penny shook her head. "No. She said Denny was furious, but when she tried to ask, he shut her out. Said it was none of her business." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Mr. Hawkins. "And you, Hawkins?" You might know something. The stables are your domain." He shifted uneasily, casting a glance over his shoulder. "I just do my work, Miss Marple. I heard shouting, sure, but I thought it was the usual village nonsense. Didn't pay it much. Mind. But that shouting could be important." Miss Marple pressed gently. Mr. Hawkins looked away. "Well, it was after that the vicar asked me to take the dog inside. Denny was already back in the garden by then." As the conversation deepened, Miss Marple's mind began piecing together a subtle pattern. A quarrel hidden behind polite smiles, a secret kept by a nervous servant, and a young man who spoke of distant adventures but could not escape the realities of the village. The next morning dawned grey and cool. Miss Marple was already at the vicarage when the postmortem report arrived. She held the letter in her hand as the vicar and his wife hovered nearby, their faces drawn with worry. The doctor read aloud, "Death was caused by poisoning. A rare and fast-acting poison, likely introduced into the punch." "Cyanide?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Yes. The chemical analysis confirms it. The amount was small but sufficient," Lavinia gasped. "But who would do such a thing? And why?" Miss Marple's eyes were calm, but inside a storm was gathering. "That is the question." Her thoughts immediately returned to the broken watch and the moment 3:17, to Denny's stories of tiger hunts and rubies, and to the quarrel he had hidden from all but a few. She had noticed, too, a small detail earlier that none had mentioned: the crushed sprig of rosemary beneath the body, the silver pin bent and dropped in the grass. All these were pieces of a puzzle. She only needed to know which ones belonged together. She resolved to visit the stables herself that afternoon to speak with Elsie and John, the servants who had carried the punch out, and perhaps saw more than they admitted. The air in the village was thick with whispered rumours by then. The post office was abuzz. The butcher's wife pressed for gossip over the garden fence, and even the school children spoke in hushed tones, their games interrupted by a new, unwelcome reality. As she walked through the narrow lane toward the ETY stables, Miss Marple's keen eyes caught sight of Elspeth Vernon sitting on a bench outside the solicitor's office, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her gaze distant. Elspeth looked up as Miss Marple approached. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "I suppose the news has made everything worse." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, seating herself beside her. "The truth often does." Elspeth swallowed. "I wish I could help, but I don't. Know anything that would explain any of this?" Miss Marple studied the young woman thoughtfully. "Sometimes what we don't say is the most telling, Elspeth. You were close to Denny, yes?" Elspeth nodded, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. "He was charming but difficult, always drifting, never quite settled. I loved him, I think. But I never really knew him." "Did he ever speak of his troubles? Anyone he might have crossed?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, but he was secretive. Sometimes I felt he was hiding something." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Secrets in a village like this tend to have roots that run deep." She stood and patted Elspeth's hand lightly. "Thank you, my dear. You've been very brave." With that, she continued on to the stables, where the afternoon sun was beginning to break through the clouds. Elsie and John were working quietly, brushing down saddles and arranging hay. Miss Marple's presence was met with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. "Good afternoon," she said gently. I wonder if I might ask you a few questions about the garden party and what happened just before." Elsie wiped her hands on her apron, glancing at John, who nodded stiffly. "Well, Miss Marple, it's all a dreadful mess," Elsie began. "But I did see Mr. Colthorpe in a bad mood earlier, near the stables. He was muttering about money and some trouble he'd got himself into," John added quietly. "He argued with a stranger that morning, someone who came by to see him. I didn't get a good look." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her knitting needles. "Did the stranger stay long?" "No," said Elsie. "Just long enough to raise Mr. Colthorpe's temper. Then he left in a hurry." "Did anyone else see him?" Miss Marple pressed. Elsie shook her head. "No, not really. The village is small, but Mr. Colthorpe liked his secrets." As she left the stables, Miss Marple felt the weight of invisible threads pulling tighter around the village. A stranger, a quarrel, a secret debt, and a poisoned glass. The story was far from simple. Back at the vicarage, the coroner's assistant had arrived with more formal questions. But Miss Marple knew the true investigation was only just beginning. Behind every polite smile and whispered word was a tangled web of relationships, motives, and deceptions waiting to be unravelled, and Miss Marple, as always, was patient. She would listen. She would observe. Because in Lillingham Green, beneath the blooming roses and gentle facades, a darker story was waiting to be told. The day following Denny Colthorpe's sudden death dawned with a delicate mist clinging to the hedgerows and a steady drizzle softening the earth beneath the village lanes. Lillingham Green, normally so calm and predictable, now seemed shrouded in a haze of unease and whispered suspicions. Miss Marple stepped out from the vicarage with her parasol tilted just so, the damp air crisp against her cheeks as she walked, purposefully toward the village hall, where the coroner's inquest was due to begin. Inside, a small gathering had already assembled. The vicar, Reverend Baring, Constable Abrams, his face pale and tight with responsibility, Lavinia Colthorpe, looking wan and subdued, and curiously, Lionel Vernon, the solicitor, who had appeared early and took a seat near the back. Miss Marple's eyes settled briefly on each, noting the subtle tensions that rippled beneath the surface of their composed appearances. The inquest began with the usual formalities. The coroner read the autopsy report aloud, confirming the presence of cyanide in Denny's system, introduced via the punch at the garden party. The question of how and by whom the poison was administered immediately dominated the room. Constable Abrams offered what he knew. No one but the household servants had access to the punch bowl before it was set out. Miss Lavinia prepared it, with the help of Elsie and John, the servants. Lavinia's hands trembled slightly as she nodded. "I did indeed prepare the punch, but I can swear I tasted it myself before serving. It was perfectly fine." Miss Marple's glance shifted to Elsie, who sat quietly in a corner, her face flushed with embarrassment and unease. The housemaid's eyes flicked nervously toward John, the stableman, seated beside her, who sat rigid as if bracing himself for a verdict. After the formal inquest concluded, the villagers dispersed slowly, each carrying a personal burden of suspicion or grief. Miss Marple lingered, her mind already weaving the thread she had gathered into a tentative pattern. Later that afternoon, she found herself in the vicarage garden again, this time with the quiet intent to speak with Elsie and John directly. The sun, briefly breaking through the lingering clouds, filtered through the old oak leaves, casting dappled shadows on the path. Elsie appeared hesitant, but with Miss Marple's gentle encouragement, she began to speak. Mr. Colthorpe was worried. "About something before the party, ma'am," she said softly. "I overheard him talking on the phone the day before. He seemed upset. Said something about a debt he couldn't repay." "Did he mention who he owed?" Miss Marple asked. Elsie shook her head. "No, but John told me he saw a man in town. That morning someone Mr. Colthorpe didn't want anyone to meet. They argued near the stables." John's eyes flicked toward Miss Marple. "It was a stranger, that's for sure. I didn't catch his name. He left in a hurry after the quarrel." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her brow furrowed in thought. "And the punch? Did either of you handle it after it was prepared?" "No, ma'am," Elsie replied. "Once the punch was brought out, Mr. Colthorpe helped himself. I didn't see anyone else near the bowl until the party began." John nodded. "The punch wasn't touched after it was set. The pieces fit uneasily together: a stranger's visit, a heated argument, a hidden debt, and a poisoned drink. But something still eluded Miss Marple's grasp." Returning to the village, Miss Marple's steps led her toward the post office, where she hoped to catch up with Mrs. Charity Hockley. Charity was the village's unofficial chronicler and dispenser of gossip, a fountain of information, albeit sometimes distorted by personal bias. Inside, the post office was warm and fragrant with the scent of fresh bread from the bakery next door. Charity looked up from her counter, her keen eyes bright with curiosity and a touch of mischief. "Ah, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice. "I hear you're poking about in that Colthorpe mess. Not surprising." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Curiosity is a necessity in such matters, Charity. Have you heard anything of interest?" Charity leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's talk of Mr. Colthorpe's financial troubles. Not just debts, but some rather shadowy dealings with a man from London. They say Denny got in too deep with the wrong sort of people." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Did you catch the name of this man?" Charity shook her head. "No, but I heard the name Vernon mentioned more than once. Curious that, given Elspeth's family here." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her mind turning over this new lead. "And have you noticed anything unusual?" "About Elspeth's behaviour since the incident?" Charity's eyes narrowed slightly. "She's been withdrawn, yes, but more than that, I caught her meeting with someone near the old mill last night. She didn't want to be seen, but a keen eye misses little." Miss Marple thanked Charity and stepped back into the drizzle outside. The old mill was just on the outskirts of the village, a lonely place, rumoured to be a haunt for secrets and clandestine meetings. She decided to visit the Vernons next, curious to learn more about their involvement. Lionel Vernon greeted her with polite reserve, though his eyes flickered with a guarded unease. "Miss Marple," he said, "I'm sure you understand how painful these events have been for my family." "I do indeed," she replied gently. "But truth must be sought, no matter how uncomfortable." Lionel nodded, then hesitated before adding, "Elspeth is a good girl, but perhaps too trusting for her own good. Denny Colthorpe was charming, but I have always suspected he was hiding something." "Did he confide in you about his troubles?" Miss Marple inquired. "Only in vague terms," Vernon said. "He spoke of debts and threats, but never revealed details. I warned Elspeth to be cautious, but young hearts often overlook such advice." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "And what of this stranger seen arguing with Mr. Colthorpe near the stables?" Vernon frowned. "I know nothing of any visitor. If such a man exists, He has yet to show himself to me." Before Miss Marple could respond, a soft knock came at the door. It was Elspeth herself, looking pale and uncertain. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said quietly. "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple said warmly. "Please come in." Elspeth sat, twisting a handkerchief in her lap. "I wanted to say, if there is anything I can do to help find out what happened to Denny, I will." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Thank you, Elspeth. It is often the quietest voices that hold the most important truths." As Elspeth left, Miss Marple turned back to Lionel Vernon, her mind racing. The threads of this mystery were pulling tighter. Debts, threats, a hidden visitor, and now a secret meeting near the mill. The pieces of the puzzle were emerging, but the picture was far from complete. That evening, as twilight faded into night, Miss Marple returned to her cosy sitting room at the vicarage. She settled into her favourite armchair with her knitting, the familiar rhythm calming her restless mind. She reflected on the day's discoveries, the silences, the half-truths, the whispered warnings. Each detail was a stitch in the fabric of a deeper story, one that reached beyond the surface of polite village life. Outside, the wind stirred the rose bushes gently, carrying with it the scent of rosemary and something darker, a reminder that in Lillingham Green, even the sweetest garden could conceal deadly secrets. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The watch that stopped at 3:17, the poisoned punch, the quarrel in the stables, and the strangers lurking in the shadows, all were threads waiting to be woven into a final, revealing tapestry. And she would be there, patiently watching, quietly unravelling the truth hidden beneath layers of deception. The morning sun rose pale and tentative over Lillingham Green, the dampness from the previous day's drizzle lingering in the air like a hesitant promise of clearing skies. Miss Marple, wrapped in her usual shawl and with a fresh pot of tea at her elbow, sat in the vicarage parlour reviewing the notes she had made over the last 2 days. The puzzle before her was growing more complex with every conversation and revelation, yet the smaller details, the ones most others dismissed, were beginning to knit together into a subtle pattern. Her thoughts returned again to the watch on Denny Colthorpe's wrist, stopped precisely at 3:17, a broken timepiece, a frozen moment in the midst of chaos. Such an object was rarely broken by accident, especially on a man who took pride in his appearance. It was more than a symbol. It was a message, a clue, masked in everyday familiarity. With a soft knock, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Baring, entered, bearing a tray. "The others will be arriving shortly, Jane. The solicitor said he wished to speak with you again. And there's talk that the police might reopen the investigation despite Constable Abrams's insistence that the case was closed quickly." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you, Edith. It is good that people are asking questions. There is much yet to be uncovered." The front door opened and the sharp voices of several villagers filtered in from the porch. Lavinia Colthorpe entered, her pale face drawn tight, followed by Charity Hockley, who carried herself with her usual air of self-importance. Lionel Vernon appeared shortly after, accompanied by his sister Elspeth, who seemed less sure-footed than usual. Miss Marple greeted them all with calm politeness, her eyes quietly observing their expressions and body language. "Please, everyone, sit. I have been reflecting on what we have learned so far." Lavinia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Jane, you must understand that our family's reputation is at stake. It was a tragic accident. There is no need to dig further." But an accident does not explain poison in the punch, Miss Marple said gently, nor the quarrel Mr. Colthorpe had with a stranger the morning of the party. Charity scoffed lightly. A stranger? I hardly think Lillingham. Green has many visitors, and any quarrel is surely blown out of proportion. Elspeth looked at Charity sharply, but said nothing. Lionel Vernon spoke instead, his voice measured. I believe Miss Marple is correct to press on. The truth matters, and it is our duty to uncover it. The room grew quiet, the weight of suspicion settling over them like a shroud. Miss Marple took a breath and began to speak of the small overlooked details, the crushed sprig of rosemary near the body, a symbol often associated with remembrance, but also with fidelity and secrecy. I suspect this was deliberately left to be found, she said. A message, perhaps. Lavinia shivered, crossing her arms. But what message? What possible motive could anyone have for killing Denny? Miss Marple's eyes rested on Charity. Money, Edith. You heard from Elsie that Mr. Colthorpe was burdened by debts. Secrets tend to flourish where money is involved. Charity looked, affronted, but said nothing. Before the conversation could continue, there was a sudden knock on the door. Constable Abrams entered, a new, serious expression on his face. Miss Marple, I have news. The man seen arguing with Mr. Colthorpe has been identified. All eyes turned to him. He goes by the name of Harold Crane, Abrams continued, a businessman from London, not known to the village. He was in the area investigating some financial dealings related to Mr. Colthorpe. Miss Marple leaned forward, fingers steepled. And what sort of dealings? Abrams hesitated. It appears that Mr. Colthorpe had borrowed a significant sum, and Mr. Crane was pressing for repayment. Lavinia gasped, clutching the back of a chair. I had no idea. Nor did I, said Lionel Vernon, his face darkening. This changes the complexion of the entire affair. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed. And if Mr. Crane's visit led to the quarrel, it might have precipitated the events that ended in tragedy. The vicar, who had been silent until now, spoke quietly. This stranger could have deeper reasons than debt alone. There are often undercurrents beneath such transactions. Blackmail, betrayal. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together possibilities. But the key lay not only in the quarrel, but in the subtle human behaviours she had observed, the nervous glance of the housemaid, the reluctant truthfulness of the stableman, and most especially, the inscrutable faces of those closest to Denny. Later that day, Miss Marple took a slow walk toward the village green, her thoughts heavy but focused. She paused outside the post office where Charity was busy with customers, but took a moment to exchange a knowing glance. Miss Marple, Charity whispered, if you're interested, I heard that Mr. Crane has been seen speaking with Elspeth Vernon more than once. Late at night, near the old mill. The old mill again, the place where shadows seemed to lengthen and secrets gathered. Miss Marple nodded quietly. Thank you, Charity. That is most helpful. As the sun began to lower, casting a golden hue over the village, Miss Marple found herself once more near the old mill. It was a lonely place, where broken machinery rusted and wild ivy crept through crumbling stone. From the shadows emerged Elspeth Vernon, looking startled but not frightened. Miss Marple approached gently. Elspeth, I wonder if I might ask you about your acquaintance with Mr. Crane? Elspeth hesitated, then sighed. He approached me with offers of help, Financial help for my family. Denny's debts have caused difficulties for us all. But I don't trust him. He is not who he seems. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? He's sharp and persuasive, Elspeth said. But there's something cold about him. I fear he is more interested in control than kindness. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind racing through the possibilities. Harold Crane's presence had become a focal point, an outsider whose appearance stirred the village's carefully balanced tensions. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by the fire in the vicarage parlour, the steady ticking of the old grandfather clock filling the silence, she reflected on the day's revelations. The watch that stopped during a lie, the poison in the punch, the stranger with a debt to collect, and the young woman caught between loyalty and fear. Miss Marple knew that the key to unravelling the truth lay not in the obvious suspects, but in the quiet moments, the flickers of hesitation and glances cast aside. She would watch, listen, and wait. For in Lillingham Green the smallest detail could hold the greatest significance, and the truth, once uncovered, would bring both justice and sorrow. Outside, the night deepened, and the village settled into uneasy dreams, unaware that the past and present were weaving a story more tangled than anyone had yet imagined. The next morning arrived in Lillingham Green, with a crispness in the air that hinted at the coming summer. Miss Marple was already up, seated by the window with her knitting, eyes occasionally flicking to the village street below where life carried on with a cautious normalcy. But beneath the calm surface, the undercurrents of suspicion and hidden truths had not subsided. Rather, they seemed to pulse with greater intensity. Constable Abrams called at the vicarage just as the village clock chimed 10. His expression was grave, yet there was a spark of urgency in his eyes. "Miss Marple, I have news you might find interesting. Harold Crane has been seen again, this time meeting with someone at the village inn late last night." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And who was his companion?" Abrams hesitated before replying. "It was Lavinia Colthorpe." At that, Miss Marple's knitting paused. The quiet, reserved Lavinia, widow of the deceased, meeting with the stranger who had so recently argued with her husband. This certainly added another layer to the mystery. "Did you speak with her?" Miss Marple asked. "Not yet. I intended to follow up, but I thought it best to inform you first." "Thank you, Constable. Please do keep me informed." She felt the familiar thrill of the chase, the delicate unfolding of the hidden story beneath polite village smiles. Later that day, Miss Marple called on Lavinia at the Colthorpe estate, a modest but well-kept house on the edge of the village. Lavinia received her with a strained politeness, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights and perhaps something more guarded. "I understand you met with Mr. Crane," Miss Marple began gently, "and I wondered if you might tell me more about your conversation." Lavinia's fingers trembled slightly as she took a delicate cup of tea from a tray. "It was difficult. Mr. Crane came to discuss my late husband's debts, pressing me for repayment or for information. I told him I was not involved in Denny's affairs, but he insisted." "Did he threaten you?" She shook her head. "No outright threats, but his manner was firm and insistent. I feared what might happen if I refused to cooperate." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did you happen to mention this meeting to anyone?" Lavinia's eyes flickered, uncertain. "Only to my solicitor, Mr. Vernon." "Of course," Miss Marple said softly. "And what did Mr. Vernon say?" "He advised me to be cautious and not to engage further without legal counsel. He promised to look into Mr. Crane's background. Wise advice, Miss Marple agreed. Might I speak with Mr. Vernon as well? Before Lavinia could answer, a knock came at the door, and Lionel Vernon entered, looking slightly startled to see Miss Marple. "Miss Marple," he said formally, "I was just about to call upon you myself. There are matters I believe we should discuss." As Vernon sat, he explained that he had made inquiries into Harold Crane. "I found that Mr. Crane has a somewhat checkered past. Financial irregularities, associations with less reputable business circles. He appears to have targeted my late client, Mr. Colthorpe, for more than just repayment." Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. "What else did you discover?" "There is talk of blackmail," Vernon said quietly. "Certain secrets Mr. Colthorpe wanted to keep hidden. Mr. Crane may have been attempting to use these to his advantage." Lavinia paled, but remained silent. Miss Marple made a mental note to return to the household servants soon. Sometimes the walls spoke louder than the owners. As Vernon left, Miss Marple lingered in the garden, letting her mind wander to the seemingly innocuous household items and the village's social fabric. She recalled the stableman's uneasy demeanour and the maid's nervousness, the presence of the stopped watch, and the elusive, shadowy meetings at the old mill. Every one of these details was a thread, and it was her task to find how they intertwined. Later that afternoon, she sought out Elsie and John, hoping that a more private conversation might yield new information. The two met her near the village, green, their eyes darting anxiously as if afraid to be overheard. Elsie spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I've not told before, Miss Marple. On the day of the party, I saw Mr. Colthorpe arguing, not just with Mr. Crane, but also with someone else. It was a woman, I think, but I didn't recognize her. They spoke harshly, and Mr. Colthorpe looked frightened." John nodded in agreement. "Yes, and later, after the punch was set out, I saw that same woman near the house. She left quickly when she spotted me." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Did you catch any details? Hair colour? Clothing?" Elsie hesitated, then said, "Dark hair, wearing a green coat. She moved like she wanted to be unnoticed." That description was oddly familiar. The only dark-haired woman with ties to the village was Elspeth Vernon, but her interactions had seemed open rather than secretive. Or perhaps it was someone else, a stranger yet unseen. Determined to resolve this uncertainty, Miss Marple decided to visit the inn that evening, where many village conversations took place over glasses of ale and cups of tea. The low murmur of voices greeted her as she stepped inside, and eyes turned her way briefly before returning to their own concerns. Near the hearth sat Harold Crane, his sharp features illuminated by the firelight, speaking quietly with Lavinia. "Colthorpe." Miss Marple settled at a nearby table, observing the pair carefully. There was tension between them, an undercurrent of bargaining and guarded words. Across the room, the landlady, Mrs. Penrose, offered Miss Marple a knowing look. "I don't trust that man, ma'am. He's been here since the news broke, poking about, asking questions that don't belong to him." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "And what of Miss Vernon? Have you seen her recently?" "Late last night. She met with that Crane fellow near the back door," Mrs. Penrose said, lowering her voice. "Didn't look like a friendly chat." As the evening wore on, Miss Marple noticed Crane's glances toward the door, as if waiting for someone, or fearing interruption. Suddenly the door opened and Elspeth Vernon entered, her face flushed from the cool night air. She approached Crane hesitantly, and the two exchanged hurried words before she left as abruptly as she came. Miss Marple's thoughts churned. What alliance or secret could unite Elspeth Vernon and Harold Crane? What was the woman's role in this dangerous game? The following morning brought another surprise. Constable Abrams informed Miss Marple that the stopped watch had been examined more closely and was found to contain a faint trace of poison on its surface, not inside, but on the casing itself. A sign, perhaps, that the watch was handled by the poisoner shortly before or after the crime, Abrams suggested. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Or a deliberate distraction to draw attention away from the true method. The village's delicate balance continued to shift, the invisible threads pulling tighter with each new revelation. Miss Marple understood that the final truth lay buried beneath layers of fear, loyalty, and deception. She resolved to continue, watching, listening, and piecing together the subtle clues, knowing that soon the moment to reveal the murderer's identity would come. And with it, the unmasking of a lie that had stopped time itself at 3:17. The afternoon sun hung low and warm over Lillingham Green as Miss Marple sat quietly in the vicarage garden, the gentle hum of village life rising around her. Yet despite the calm veneer, the mystery pressed relentlessly at her thoughts, its threads weaving ever tighter in her mind. The events of the past days had unravelled much, yet the core truth remained elusive, as though the village itself held its breath, unwilling to reveal the full extent of its secrets. She had been reflecting on the strange behaviour of Harold Crane and Elspeth Vernon. Their late-night meetings, the whispered words behind closed doors, and the sudden appearance of a woman in a green coat, all pieces of a puzzle still lacking its centrepiece. Her gaze drifted toward the road where a solitary figure was approaching. Lionel Vernon, looking somewhat weary yet resolved. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a nod. "May I join you?" "Of course, Lionel," she replied warmly. "You look troubled." "I am," he admitted, settling on the bench beside her. "These past days have been difficult for us all. And yet, I fear there are truths about my family that I have only now begun to understand." Miss Marple's eyes were keen. "I sensed as much. Pray, tell me what weighs on your mind." He took a deep breath. "It concerns Elspeth. You have seen her interactions with Mr. Crane, but there is more. She has been secretive, withdrawn. Last night I confronted her about these meetings. She confessed that she believed Mr. Crane was threatening the family, demanding information she did not possess." Miss Marple inclined her head, encouraging him to continue. "Moreover, she told me that my late brother Denny was involved in matters darker than mere debts. There were rumours of forged documents, perhaps even embezzlement. If true, it would explain why Mr. Crane was so persistent and dangerous." "Quite a tangled web," Miss Marple murmured, her mind tracing the connections. "And Elspeth? Does she fear for her own safety?" Lionel's brow furrowed. "Yes. She begged me not to involve the police further, fearing it would only worsen things." Miss Marple's gaze softened. Sometimes fear binds people more tightly than guilt. As they spoke, a distant shout broke their reverie. Villagers gathered near the village green, voices raised and agitated. Miss Marple and Lionel rose, curiosity quickening their steps. At the centre stood Elsie, visibly distressed. "It's John! He's missing!" A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple approached Elsie gently. "Tell me what happened." Elsie's eyes were wide and frantic. "He went to the old mill early this morning to check on the equipment. He never returned." Miss Marple's mind raced. The old mill, the site of so many secretive meetings, and shadows. She exchanged a glance with Lionel, whose face grew pale. "Have the constables searched?" she asked. "They're organizing a search party now," Elsie replied, voice trembling. Without hesitation, Miss Marple moved toward the mill, Lionel close behind. The door creaked as they entered, the dim interior filled with the scent of damp, wood and oil. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the area, footprints, a broken lantern, and on the floor, faint smudges of what looked like dried blood. "Something has happened here," she said quietly. "John is in danger." As they stepped deeper inside, a faint sound echoed, a groan barely audible. "Over here," Miss Marple called, hurrying toward the noise. Behind a pile of discarded machinery, they found John, his face pale but conscious. "I was attacked," he whispered. "Someone struck me from behind, but I don't know who." Miss Marple helped him to his feet. "Do you remember anything else?" John shook his head. "Only that I saw a shadow, someone moving quickly, and a flash of green." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The green coat, the mysterious woman Elsie had described. Outside, the villagers gathered anxiously, the news spreading like wildfire. The attack on John was no accident but a warning, a desperate attempt to silence a witness. Back at the vicarage, as John rested and was tended by the local doctor, Miss Marple gathered those closest to the case, Lionel, Lavinia, and Elsie. The atmosphere was tense, shadows of suspicion stretching between them. "Who among us might wish John harm?" Miss Marple asked gently. The room fell silent. Lavinia's eyes flicked nervously to the window. "Could it be Mr. Crane? He has already shown himself willing to threaten and manipulate. Or perhaps someone else, seeking to protect secrets buried deeper," Lionel added. Denny's dealings were not straightforward. Elsie spoke softly. "There is someone I have not mentioned before. The housemaid, Mary. She has been strangely distant, avoiding questions. Last night I saw her leave the kitchen with a small parcel." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "A parcel? Have you any idea what it contained?" "No," Elsie admitted, "but it was wrapped carefully and hidden beneath her apron." The maid's sudden secrecy added another layer of intrigue. Mary's position gave her access to much knowledge and opportunity. That evening, Miss Marple found herself once more walking toward the Colthorpe estate, seeking answers in the places others overlooked. Mary was in the scullery, her hands trembling slightly as she scrubbed a tea set. "Mary," Miss Marple began softly, "I wonder if I might speak with you for a moment." The girl looked startled but complied, stepping outside into the cool night air. "Is there something troubling you?" Miss Marple asked kindly. "Something you wish to share?" Mary hesitated, then nodded. I was frightened. I saw Mr. Crane talking with Elspeth late at night. They seemed to argue. Then, after the party, I found a vial hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the drawing room." Miss Marple's interest was piqued. "A vial?" "Yes," Mary said. "It was small, with a faint smell. I hid it because I didn't know what it was. I feared it might be poison." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. The poison, The stopped watch, the green coat, the secret meetings, the attack on John. It all hinted at a desperate attempt to conceal something darker. "Mary," Miss Marple said gently, "you have done well to tell me this. You must not be afraid." Mary nodded, tears in her eyes. "I want the truth to come out, Miss Marple." As Miss Marple escorted Mary back inside, her mind turned over the revelations of the day. The danger was escalating. The murderer was growing reckless, their carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. But the heart of the mystery, the motive, the who and the why, still eluded her. Yet she knew with a quiet certainty that the truth was near, and when it emerged, it would shine a light on every shadow, expose every lie, and bring justice to Lillingham Green once more. As dawn crept gently over Lillingham Green, the village seemed to hold its breath in the fragile quiet before the day's stirrings. Miss Marple sat at her usual spot by the window, a steaming cup of tea balanced in her hands, but her mind was far from the simple pleasure of morning light. The events of the previous day had deepened the mystery into something more urgent and dangerous. The attack on John was no mere scare tactic, but a desperate move by someone who feared discovery. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Lionel Vernon entered, his face taut with the weight of sleepless hours. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about what Mary revealed. The vial hidden beneath. The floorboard. What if it was the very poison used to kill my brother?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That is a reasonable supposition, and its concealment there suggests premeditation. Someone prepared the means long before the murder, planning to use it when the moment was right." He paced the room, his fingers steepled. But who and why? If Denny had secrets, perhaps they were worth killing to protect. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "and I suspect the key lies in that stopped watch. It did not merely mark the time of death, but served as a silent witness to a deception." The morning was spent in quiet investigation. Miss Marple revisited the Colthorpe estate, this time inspecting the drawing room with a keen eye. Near the hearth, she noticed a slight irregularity, a faint scratch on the wooden floor near the spot where the watch had been found. Kneeling, she observed the grain of the wood, noting that a small patch appeared newer, almost as if it had been disturbed recently. "Someone hid or retrieved something here," she murmured. Her attention was drawn to the mantelpiece where the clock ticked steadily, a stark contrast to the broken watch. She wondered whether the timepieces were symbolically or literally linked. Later, she arranged to meet with the constable and Lionel at the inn, where they could discuss their findings with discretion. Over cups of steaming tea, Miss Marple unfolded the map of suspicion carefully. Mr. Crane's persistence, Elspeth's secrecy, Lavinia's fear, Mary's discovery, John's attack, all threads in a tapestry that tells of greed, betrayal, and desperation. Constable Abrams frowned. "But the evidence is circumstantial. We have no proof yet that ties anyone definitively." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Ah, but the proof lies in the patterns of behavior, the subtle slips, the hushed conversations, the motives beneath the surface. It is a matter of observing human nature closely." Their talk was interrupted by the arrival of Lavinia Colthorpe, who looked pale but resolute. "I must confess," she said quietly, "that I withheld something important. On the day of the party, I found a letter in Denny's study. It was addressed to Mr. Crane and mentioned a meeting at the mill tonight. A hush fell over the group. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. A meeting arranged for tonight? Then it seems the pieces are aligning. Perhaps the murderer intends to strike again, or to meet a conspirator. That evening, under a moonlit sky, Miss Marple, accompanied by Lionel and Constable Abrams, made their way toward the old mill once more. The village seemed hushed, as if holding its breath for the final act. As they approached, voices drifted through the open doorway, peering. Inside, Miss Marple recognized Elspeth Vernon and Harold Crane locked in a heated exchange. "You promised me protection." Elspeth's voice was sharp but tinged with desperation. "But you only use me as a pawn." Crane's reply was cold. "You knew the risks. I need the documents. Without them, everything falls apart." Suddenly, the flickering light revealed a third figure lurking in the shadows, the unmistakable silhouette of Lavinia Colthorpe. Miss Marple felt the tension snap tight. "Lavinia," Elspeth exclaimed, startled. "I came to confront you both," Lavinia said steadily. "I know the truth now. Denny was not the man you thought, and I will not let you destroy what remains of our family." Crane's eyes glittered dangerously. "And what truth is that, Mrs. Colthorpe?" Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but commanding. "The truth that has been hidden beneath layers of deceit and fear, that this murder was not a crime of passion, but one of calculated betrayal." The three suspects turned toward her, surprise flickering across their faces. Miss Marple continued, "I have watched, listened, and pieced together the fragments. The stopped watch marked the exact moment when lies began to unravel. The poison vial was hidden beneath the floorboards by someone who believed their secret was safe." She looked steadily at Lavinia, who trembled but did not speak. "The confrontation at the mill tonight was no accident. It was meant to settle old scores and control the narrative," Crane sneered. "You think you can play detective, old woman?" "You know nothing," Miss Marple smiled gently. "I know more than you realize." Suddenly, a noise startled them, a scuffle near the entrance. Constable Abrams moved swiftly, detaining a figure attempting to slip away into the night. It was Mary, the housemaid. "I couldn't stay silent any longer," she sobbed. "I knew too much. I tried to stop it." Miss Marple nodded kindly. "Thank you, Mary. Your courage will not be forgotten." As the constable led Mary away, Miss Marple turned back to the remaining three. "The murderer is among you, and soon the final pieces will fall into place." The village of Lillingham Green waited with bated breath, the night air heavy with secrets as the quiet storm of truth gathered strength. The night air hung heavy and still around the mill as the constable led Mary away, her sobs fading into the darkness. Miss Marple, Lionel, Lavinia, and Harold Crane remained clustered near the doorway, their faces illuminated by the pale moonlight that sifted through the broken window panes. The tension between them was almost tangible, as though the very air anticipated the unraveling of truth that had long been concealed beneath polite smiles and veiled threats. Miss Marple's eyes, calm but incisive, rested momentarily on each of the three before her. "We stand at the crossroads," she said softly, "where secrets must be laid bare and deception must finally face the daylight." Harold Crane scoffed, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "You have nothing, Miss Marple. Mere suspicion and conjecture." "I have more than that, Mr. Crane," she replied quietly. "You see, the watch that stopped at the moment of Mr. Colthorpe's death is not just a symbol. It is a marker of a lie told, of a truth hidden by careful hands." Lavinia's breath caught. What lie? What truth? Miss Marple gave a faint smile, the gentleness of it contrasting with the sharpness of her mind. The lie that John's death was a simple accident or a crime of passion. It was neither. It was an act born of calculated desperation. Lionel took a step forward. But who could have done it? So many had reasons. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, and many still conceal their motives. But it is the smallest details, the ones people think no one notices, that reveal the most. Consider the stopped watch. It was found under the drawing-room floorboards, far from the scene of the crime. Why? Harold's jaw tightened. Because someone wanted it hidden. Exactly. But more importantly, the watch stopped at 4:17 p.m., the precise time when Denny was confirmed to have been with someone else, someone who could give him an alibi. Lavinia's eyes widened. Who? Miss Marple turned to her. Elspeth Vernon. The room seemed to still. Elspeth, who had been standing quietly in the shadows until now, finally stepped forward. Her face was pale, but her eyes shone with a mix of defiance and sorrow. Yes, she said, voice trembling. I was with Denny at that time, but I did not kill him. Then who? Lionel demanded, frustration breaking through his usual composure. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Harold Crane. Mr. Crane, you came to Lillingham Green with intentions beyond mere financial negotiations. You sought to recover documents that would expose a forgery scandal linked to Mr. Colthorpe's business dealings. You threatened Elspeth to gain access to these documents, believing she possessed them. Crane's face darkened. And you think that justifies murder? No, Miss Marple replied softly, but it does explain your desperation and your threats. Yet the murderer is someone else. Someone who stood to lose far more if the truth came out. She looked at Lavinia. You, Mrs. Colthorpe, feared the scandal would destroy your family's reputation and fortune. You confronted Denny at the mill, demanding he cease his actions. Lavinia nodded, tears welling. I did, but I did not kill him. I only wanted to protect what was left. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Lionel. And you, Lionel, were you aware of these dealings? He shook his head. No. I thought my brother was troubled, but I never suspected the extent. Miss Marple turned back to the others. Then who had the means, the opportunity, and the deepest motive? A silence stretched, heavy and expectant. I believe it was John Ellis, she said finally. Shock flickered across the faces of Lavinia and Lionel. John? Lionel exclaimed. But he was attacked. Precisely, Miss Marple said. An attempt to silence him because he had discovered the truth. She explained how John's investigation into the financial irregularities led him to uncover forged documents implicating the Colthorpe family in fraudulent schemes. John had planned to reveal this at the party, threatening to destroy the family's standing. His determination to expose the truth made him a target. And the poison vial? Lavinia asked. That was intended for John, Miss Marple said. Found hidden in the drawing-room where he often worked late. Harold Crane muttered, But why kill Denny first? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because Denny's death could be disguised as an accident or natural causes, buying time to handle the others and silence any threats. Unfortunately for the murderer, John was resilient, and the attempted attack on him failed. A sudden realization dawned on Lionel. John's watch stopped at the moment he was confronted. Exactly, said Miss Marple. The watch's stopping was caused by a strong blow to the wrist, an indication of a violent encounter. As the pieces settled into place, a figure stepped forward from the shadows. It was John himself, now recovered enough to walk, his face pale but resolute. "I overheard enough to piece together what happened," he said firmly. "It was Mary, who tried to help me but was too afraid to speak until now." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Mary's courage has been invaluable," John continued. "I confronted Denny about the forgeries, and things got out of control. I never intended for him to die, but he threatened to ruin me if I revealed the truth. I had no choice but to defend myself." There was a collective intake of breath. "So it was self-defense?" Lionel asked, conflicted. "Yes," John admitted. "But then I tried to cover it up out of fear. I didn't want to destroy my friends, family, or the village peace." Miss Marple's voice softened. "Truth can be a bitter pill, but it is the only remedy for justice." The constable stepped forward, ready to take John into custody, but with an understanding of the complexities involved. As dawn broke over Lillingham Green, the tangled threads of deception began to unravel, leaving the village forever changed. Miss Marple, ever the observer, reflected quietly on the nature of human frailty, the lies told to protect, the secrets kept in fear, and the courage it takes to face one's own truth. The first blush of dawn cast a pale light over Lillingham Green, softening the village's edges, but doing little to ease the weight that hung over its people. The revelations of the night still resonated through the air, a mix of shock, sorrow, and the fragile stirrings of reluctant acceptance. Miss Marple sat quietly in the parlour of her cottage, the steady tick of her own mantel clock seeming to echo the finality settling in the village. Around her, the gentle hum of early morning life began to awaken, a dog barking in the distance, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the faint chiming of church bells calling the faithful to their Sunday service. The events of the previous evening had turned the village's world upside down. But now, as the first rays of sunlight crept through the lace curtains, there was a sense that the worst had passed. John Ellis, though still pale and fragile, was being tended to with care, his confession and account of self-defense understood by those who knew the complexity of human nature and circumstance. The constable's firm but compassionate handling of the situation had calmed the community, preventing hysteria and preserving the delicate threads of social harmony that still bound the village together. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the little stopped watch resting on the table beside her, a silent, steadfast witness to the tangled truth. It was a small thing, easily overlooked by many, but for her it was a symbol of the fragile balance between honesty and deception, between the outward appearances of peace and the hidden storms beneath. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Lavinia Colthorpe, her expression tired but resolved. She entered quietly, taking a seat opposite Miss Marple. "I wanted to thank you," Lavinia said softly, "for seeing through the veil, for uncovering what we could not face ourselves." Miss Marple smiled gently. "The truth is often a burden no one wishes to bear, Mrs. Colthorpe. But it is also the foundation upon which healing can begin." Lavinia sighed. "I fear the scandal will leave scars on this village that time alone may not heal." "That may be so," Miss Marple agreed. "But secrets kept in shadows tend to fester. It is only by bringing them to light that we allow the possibility of forgiveness." The two women sat in companionable silence for a moment before Lavinia continued. "John's self-defense, do you believe the village will understand?" Miss Marple considered this. Human nature is complex. People will speak in whispers and speculate, but over time, the truth as you now know it will settle in their minds. It is not for me to judge how they will react, only to ensure that what is right is known. Lavinia nodded, a tear tracing a silent path down her cheek. "Thank you, Miss Marple." As Lavinia left, Miss Marple turned her attention to the day ahead. There were still loose ends to be tied, explanations to be offered, and the village to be gently guided back toward a semblance of normalcy. She resolved to visit the Colthorpe estate again, to speak with Lionel and ensure he had support, to help him understand his brother's complex life and choices. Walking through the quiet village streets, Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the subtle signs of resilience: a child playing near the bakery, shopkeepers preparing for the day, neighbours exchanging cautious greetings. Life, she reflected, was always a delicate dance between pain and hope. At the Colthorpe estate, Lionel greeted her with a tired smile. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple. It has been a difficult time." She nodded. "Grief often reveals the truths we were blind to before. Your brother was a man entangled in difficult choices, but he was also someone who cared deeply." Miss Hall sighed, sitting down heavily. "I wish I had known more, done more." "Now you can," Miss Marple said gently, "and perhaps your presence will help the village heal." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Constable Abrams, who brought word that Mary, the housemaid, had spoken at length with the police. Her testimony cleared many misunderstandings and helped reconstruct a clearer timeline of events. Miss Marple found herself admiring Mary's quiet courage. "Sometimes the smallest voices hold the greatest truths," she mused aloud. The day passed with a steady rhythm of conversations and reflections. Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the village square, where a small gathering was forming. The villagers, wary but curious, had come to hear what little official news was available. Standing before them, the constable spoke carefully, emphasizing the complexities and urging kindness and understanding. The crowd listened, some nodding in reluctant acceptance, others whispering in disbelief. Miss Marple mingled quietly among them, her presence unnoticed but reassuring. She listened to their fears and hopes, their accusations and defenses. Her understanding of human nature told her that the wounds would take time to heal, but they were not beyond repair. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the village, Miss Marple returned home. She sat once more by the window, the stopped watch now resting peacefully beside her. She thought of the web of human frailty, how lies were told to protect, how secrets were kept out of fear, and how ultimately it was the courage to face the truth that brought light to the darkest corners. The village of Lillingham Green had been shaken to its core, but it would endure. And Miss Marple, with her gentle wisdom and unyielding insight into the human heart, would be there to watch, to listen, and to help when the shadows returned. For in every small village, beneath every polite smile, there are stories waiting to be told, secrets waiting to be uncovered, and truths waiting to set the world right. And Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, was their quiet guardian. The village had settled into an uneasy quiet by the time Miss Marple made her way back to the drawing-room of the Colthorpe estate. The afternoon light streamed softly through, the tall windows casting long shadows that seemed to hold the weight of all that had transpired. Around her the heavy curtains and polished wood bore witness to secrets now laid bare. Miss Marple's calm eyes met those of the assembled few. Lavinia, Lionel, Harold Crane, and John Ellis. The constable stood quietly to the side, respectful of the moment about to unfold. "Thank you all for gathering," Miss Marple began gently. "I know the past days have been difficult, and that many truths have caused pain. But before this chapter closes, there is one final piece to place. A truth that will bind the threads of this mystery together." She paused, allowing the room to settle, watching for any flicker of recognition or fear. "You see," she continued, "while John Ellis's actions were in self-defense, and the motives behind the tensions between the Colthorpes and Mr. Crane are clear, there remains a question of the watch, why it was stopped, and why it was hidden where it was found." Harold Crane shifted uneasily, eyes narrowing. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The watch was not stopped by chance or accident, but by intention. A heavy blow to the wrist, as we know, was given, one that also sent Mr. Colthorpe to his death. Yet the watch was hidden away from the scene. That act was a message, a deliberate misdirection. She turned to Lionel. "You told me your brother was troubled by shadows from the past, and you suspected there were secrets in the family." Lionel nodded slowly, frowning. "Those secrets," Miss Marple said, "were kept not only to protect reputations, but to cover acts of desperation." Her gaze moved to Lavinia, whose face remained composed but weary. "Mrs. Colthorpe, your fears to preserve your family's honour are understandable, but the true heart of the matter lies deeper." She faced Harold Crane squarely. "Mr. Crane, you believed that by recovering certain documents you could salvage your own position. You threatened those around you and attempted to suppress the truth." He stiffened, but did not deny it. "And yet," Miss Marple said, "the killer is someone who stood in the shadows, unnoticed until now." A silence fell as all eyes turned toward the figure in the corner, the housekeeper, Mrs. Agnes Blythe, who had been quietly observing. "Yes, it is I," she said softly, her voice steady. "I could no longer bear the deceit and the destruction. It wrought. I confronted Mr. Colthorpe in the mill, hoping to make him stop his cruel games, especially those that hurt the younger ones in this household." Miss Marple nodded. "And in that confrontation, tempers flared, the watch was struck, and the fatal blow was dealt." Mrs. Blythe's eyes were clear, her remorse genuine. "It was not planned, nor did I wish him harm beyond a warning. But in the heat of the moment, things went terribly wrong." The room absorbed this revelation. The quiet woman, long overlooked, was the one whose desperate act had set the tragic events into motion. Miss Marple smiled gently, the compassion in her tone unmistakable. "Human nature is never simple, and justice must account for its many shades." The constable stepped forward, prepared to take Mrs. Blythe into custody, while the others grappled with the truth. Relief mingled with sorrow, understanding mingled with regret. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered a moment by the window, the stopped watch now laid to rest with dignity. The village of Lillingham Green would heal slowly, with wounds fading but memories enduring. She reflected quietly on the fragile balance between secrets and truth, on how small moments, like a stopped watch, could unravel the most tangled of webs. With a gentle smile, she turned away, ready to welcome the peace of the coming days, ever watchful, ever patient. For in every quiet village, beneath every polite facade, there were stories waiting to be told. And Miss Marple would always be there to listen.